can't imagine anything else being as intense as my relationship to this character, man. I mean, it was intense, man. I mean, I was dead in the water as a writer, as a director, as a filmmaker, and writing this thing, it gave me back my life.
Welcome to Script Apart, a podcast about the first draft secrets of great movies. Each episode, we speak to a brilliant screenwriter who's kindly dug out their initial screenplay for what became a beloved movie, discussing what changed, what didn't, and why, from first draft to the big screen. This week we have on the show none other than Barry Jenkins, writer and director of the 2016 Academy Award Best Picture, Moonlight. Adapted from an unpublished play by Tarell Alvin McCraney, Moonlight was a mesmerising three-part journey through the young adult life of Chiron, a boy grappling with his identity and sexuality, played by three different actors representing different stages of his adolescence. The movie was the first LGBTQ-themed film to win Best Picture, the first with an all-black cast to win Best Picture, and is regularly voted among the greatest films of the century so far. Barry wrote Moonlight's first draft on a solo trip to Europe, after discovering echoes of his own life in Tarell's story. Like the playwright, he had grown up in Liberty City, raised by a mother with drug dependency issues. As he explains in the conversation you're about to hear, Barry didn't know where his life and career were leading before this screenplay spilled out of him on that trip, putting him on a path towards Oscar's glory. Here's Barry, accompanied by an adorable, incredibly well-behaved puppy he adopted before lockdown, on how he went about bringing Tarell's story to screen. We discuss the LGBTQ legacy of the film's success, and also how the original ending to his film may have resulted in the actor Alex R. Hibbert being eaten by sharks. You're listening to Script Apart, hosted by me, Al Horner, produced by Kamil Demek. Hey Barry, thanks so much for joining us. How are things?
I mean, all things considered, not too bad, but I mean, it's a crazy time in the world.
How has lockdown been for you? Are you someone who's managed to stay productive amidst all the upheaval and distraction?
Yeah, it's been interesting. We were in production on this limited series we're doing for Amazon on Colson Whitehead's The Underground Railroad. And so we got through 112 of 115 days right before the lockdown began. So we've been editing basically 99% of the show. So pretty busy in that regard. And then staying busy writing. I think, I'm just very fortunate to work in a creative field where not being able to physically leave the house isn't a hindrance to work. So all in all, I've been pretty productive. That's
good to hear. Well, I'm really excited to speak a little bit later about Underground Railroad, which sounds really exciting. But first, on today's episode of Script Apart, we are delving into the evolution of Moonlight, which is a film that means a lot to me and to so many others. We're a few years removed from the film now, from its monumental success and from that dramatic Oscar win and everything else. I've had some filmmakers in the past tell me that it's not really until there's a bit of distance between you and that intense period of a movie's creation that you're finally able to kind of decompress, gain some perspective on it and reflect on it objectively. Is that the case for you? How do you look back on Moonlight today?
I think it is the case for me, especially because, at the time, so many just like really insane things happened with the film from its first screening to the end of the Oscars. And it's hard to maintain your own personal relationship to something that is every day getting further and further or deeper and deeper, into the public. And with that film, into the zeitgeist, honestly. So yeah, it is kind of nice to be a bit removed from it. I mean, my relationship to the film now is kind of driven by on social media. I think there are people who are still discovering the film, and there are people who continue to go back to it as a balm almost. And so, yeah, it's kind of cool to now realize it's not this special thing. It's just this thing. Because, the past has a way of taking all the shiny things, and making them a bit less shiny. And so, yeah, it's kind of cool. I actually watched it for the first time a few months ago in years. And I was like, yeah, it kind of holds up. I was really proud of the work we did. And then every now and then, people will tweet excerpts from the script. A24 printed this really lovely book of the script and images and a foreword by Frank Ocean. And so in that way, a piece of the script came back to me, and I hadn't read them in years. It's one thing to have not seen the film in years, but I hadn't read the script in years. And I was like, oh man, yeah, I remember doing that. And then sometimes I was like, wait, how did we do that?
Of those kind of constant outpourings on social media of love and adoration for the film, what are the kind of ones that mean the most to you? And what does it mean to you that so many people still connect with the film and want to get in touch about it?
Oh, I mean, it's undoubtedly the kids. It's usually young people who see themselves in Chiron. And because of Twitter, especially, these are people all over the world who couldn't be farther removed from the inner city of Miami, who literally find themselves identifying very intensely with this main character. That continues to move me. And then sometimes, not as often, but I'll sometimes get a message from a much older person who realizes that there was someone in their life who they didn't quite understand, and that through seeing this film, they got a better understanding of that person. And that just means the world, because this thing that was very personal to Tarell and I is now something that can become very personal to absolute strangers.
So there's so much distilled into Moonlight. It's a movie about nurture, the way that men's environments kind of steer them into these unhealthy performances of masculinity sometimes. It's also a movie about identity, about blackness, about coming of age. When you adapted the film from Tarell's play, were you kind of very conscious throughout the process of wanting to speak to these grand themes and issues? Or when you write, do you try and push that all to kind of one side? Do you just try and tell an authentic story and trust in yourself that those themes are going to come out organically?
Yeah, I try and push it to the side, especially because of my opinion on the inherent baked-in qualities of cinema and the baked-in qualities of literature. I think this idea of writing a screenplay, which is a blueprint for a film, and having the theme be at the forefront more so than the character or the scene or the scenario, that always, for me, that usually sends me working into a place where I think what ends up happening, or what I end up writing, isn't as potent in the medium of cinema as I want it to. So in writing Moonlight 1, Tarell had already done so much of the work of wrestling with these themes. Part of that effort had already been shouldered by someone else. And so for me, it was really just about drilling down, especially with this film, because I knew it was going to be 3 different chapters, 3 very distinct periods of the same character's life, and that you can't do a cradle to the grave version of anybody's life and have it be as potent. But in this case, where we're trying to take 3 snapshots, it's got to be incredibly potent. And so rather than writing towards a theme, for me, it was about writing towards the clearest scenario, the clearest happening or instance, in this character's quarter life at the moment we're dropping in. And so that kind of freed me from the pressure of trying to do justice. I'm using air quotes now, trying to do justice to those themes. And really, the big part of it was that, Tarell Alvin McCraney is a genius, the MacArthur genius. We have this thing on this side of the pond called the MacArthur Grant. And Tarell was a recipient, so he's literally a bona fide genius. And so I had faith that those themes were baked in to the premise. And for me, it was just about executing what is the most cinematic way to tell the story.
What was the task when it came to finding a cinematic telling of that story? So what was already in Tarell's play? Was, for example, you touched on the 3-act structure there. Was that something that was already baked in?
It was somewhat baked in, but Tarell is a very dense writer. And so even though it was baked in, the form of it was very complex. The way I describe it is we tell the 3 chapters in turn. We tell Little story, then Chiron's story, then Black's story. Whereas Tarell, you would see Little wake up, Chiron wake up, and then Black wake up. Then you would see Little go to school, Chiron go to school, Black go to the corner. And so he just kept progressing through this day, but he would visit each character, at this moment and the day. And there's a juxtaposition that happens in that form that's very interesting. But to me, that was the thing better either read on the page or experienced in a theater where you have one angle to view the scene from, as opposed to in cinema. I felt like if we could really drill down on the most pivotal moment in this stage of the main character's life, that over the course of the entire film would build
Mm.
a portrait that I felt was evocative in the way that I experienced the first time I read Tarell's play.
I was amazed researching the film to find out that you and Tarell grew up basically kind of a couple blocks apart from each other in Liberty City, and you even went to the same schools at certain times, but you never knew each other. Then years and years later, you're handed this amazing autobiographical work of his through a mutual industry connection. Is that correct?
Well, a mutual industry connection, again, air quotes, industry connection. There was this guy named Andrew Havia, who's a bit younger than myself and Tarell. Tarell and I are separated by 1 year. I'm 1 year older than him. And I'd say Andrew is maybe, I don't know, 5 or 6 years younger than Tarell. But Tarell and Andrew went to the same high school, and Andrew and myself went to the same film school.
Mm.
And so I didn't know Tarell, but Andrew knew both of us. And he read Tarell's piece first. And Andrew's he was just, he's a grown man now, but I always think of him as this young kid. He just was adamant. He was a part of this collective of filmmakers from Miami who took it upon themselves to try to tell Miami stories. And I was a guy who had left Miami and really had no intentions of going back to tell any stories, and certainly not to make a feature film. And so Andrew just got it in his mind that I needed to read Tarell's play and that I needed to turn Tarell's play into a film. And the thing for me, or the thing that Andrew did that was so smart, was he didn't tell me all the connections between myself and Tarell at first. He just said, hey, this guy Tarell McCraney is brilliant. He's a MacArthur genius. You should read his play. I think you'll find it really interesting. And when I read it, I was kind of confronted, because when I became a filmmaker, I never wanted to make anything that was autobiographical or semi-autobiographical. And reading Tarell's piece, the connections were very clear to me, but it still felt removed enough that I thought, oh, it's his story, not mine. But to go back to your earlier question, when you're sitting down with the script and you're working on these scenes, these very concise, these very concrete scenarios, anytime there's a connection between you and the character, you start to draw from your own experience. And so right away I realized, oh my God, I'm writing the script, and it's kind of like a combined biography of myself in Tarell's life. And one of the loveliest things that happened with Moonlight was Tarell and I went down to Miami with this writer from the New York Times, Nicole Hannah-Jones, who now also is a MacArthur genius. She recently published the 1619 Project for the New York Times. Yeah. And she took us down there, and the neighborhood that we grew up in, part of it's still there, part of it's not. And so the tenement that I grew up in has been completely razed, and the tenement Tarell grew up in has been razed as well. And so there was a moment where I stood in front of my apartment and I could point right across the square, and about 200 yards away, Tarell was standing where his apartment had been. And we were like, that's how physically close we had been as children.
This was quite a few years after your previous film, Medicine for Melancholy, which came out in 2008. I know that you wrote quite a few screenplays in that in-between period, some of which you've described as being slightly more commercial, but none of them panned out, none of them quite clicked for you. Can you tell me what some of those abandoned screenplays were like, and whether, before Moonlight came into your periphery, you were experiencing any self-doubt or fear that you might not ever find the right project you wanted to work on?
Oh, I've been experiencing extreme self-doubt. I still experience extreme self-doubt, even with shiny statues in the house. Yeah, it was a really intense time. I had to learn a few really difficult lessons. And, there was one script that I wrote before writing Moonlight that I still want to make. And it was the first step at getting away from the path I'd gone down, trying to make more commercial things to break into the industry. And what was the connection between that script and Moonlight was I wrote that script for no money. And I wrote it understanding that it would be very difficult to make, not because of finances, but because of subject matter. And yet I wrote it understanding that did not matter, and that I was writing it for the joy of the process, to honestly stretch myself as a writer. That character, just like Chiron, could not be further removed on the surface from who I am as a person, from my biography. And yet I found so much of myself in that character. That project got taken away from me. It just got taken away. And when that happened, rather than shrinking or folding into myself, I thought, oh, okay, that actually felt good though, working on that. Where else can I go? And that was when I got together with Adela Romansky, and we decided, well, you should go somewhere and write some films. And we went off and wrote both the damn films, and they both won Academy Awards, which was pretty cool.
Yeah, that's an understatement. But at what point can you tell me about, like, it must have been quite a visceral reaction that you had the first time that you came across Tarell's work and realized the level of overspill there was between his story and yours. Can you tell me a little bit about your memories of that first time?
It was and it wasn't. I remember I read it the first time. I've never said this publicly. I'll be honest. I read it the first time and I didn't reply to Andrew. I read it and I thought, whoa, that's wild. And I just pushed it aside. And Andrew's tenacious, and he just kept following up and following up and following up. And then finally, he said, you should read it again. And so I read it again. And it's kind of lovely. It's kind of cool to have this conversation now, because you think back and you see, I don't know, it's easier to draw the map backwards than it is to draw the map forwards.
Yeah.
And Adela Romansky was also hounding me at this time. It was pre-Zoom, so we were doing Google Hangouts. I was in Oakland, she was in LA, and we would just once a month have these Google Hangouts. And she would say, so what have you written? What are you working on? And I was just collating ideas. And I said, oh, this guy, Andrew Havia, did send me this play by Tarell McCraney. She's like, oh, what's it about? I was like, oh, it's about this, it's about that. She goes, oh, that actually sounds really interesting. And so I read it again. And when I read it again the second time, that was when it was almost like you watch some movie from the 90s about spies, and the main character sitting there, and then all the bulbs go off and there's all these dissolves and whatnot. It was kind of a moment like that. And I actually got on a plane and flew to Miami. And I like to say I asked Tarell for his hand in marriage, by which I mean, at that point I knew I was going to take a trip to Europe. And Andrew and I met with Tarell, and I said, would you mind if I took this play and adapted it? And he said, you have my blessing. And I said, how involved do you want to be? And he said, only as involved as you need me to be. And I realize now, looking back, it's because so much of it was extremely personal for Tarell, that the work he had done, he felt like was completed. And to have done that work again would have been to reopen these wounds. And so, I just went off to Brussels, Belgium, and wrote the script.
You mentioned an awareness that you had that the content of Moonlight might make it a bit of an uphill battle to get made. You did, of course, end up making the film with Plan B Productions, which is Brad Pitt's company. Am I right in thinking there was a bit of a twist of fate that led to that happening, involving Telluride Film Festival and an extremely last-minute Q&A with Steve McQueen?
It was cool. So the way it went was I flew to Brussels and I wrote Moonlight, the first draft in Brussels, over the course of 2 weeks. And then I took a train to Berlin and I wrote the first draft of Beale Street. And then I flew back to the States. This was in the summer of, I guess it was 2013. And I've worked at Telluride since 2002. I went there as a student and washed toilets and made popcorn. And then after I made medicine, they saw me do a Q&A for one of my own films and said, oh, you're really good at this. You want to do Q&As for other people's films? I was like, yeah, that sounds cool. And holy shit, this huge ass movie, 12 Years a Slave, by your countryman, Steve McQueen, is world premiering, and literally the world premiere. And I was told about 30 minutes before the screening that I would introduce the film and also run the post-screening Q&A. And so I did that, and it went really well. The film played through the roof and ultimately ended up winning Best Picture. And when I made my first film, Medicine, I had a few meetings with Plan B, in particular with Jeremy Kleiner. And I came off the stage and he looked at me and he goes, Barry Jenkins? I was like, yeah. He goes, man, what have you been up to? Because Medicine had been, that was 5-6 years prior. Yeah, right. Because I think he had seen it in 2007 when it was at festivals, not during its release in 2008. And I said, yeah, actually, I just came back from Europe. I adapted this James Baldwin book and this play by Tarell Alvin McCraney. He goes, oh, cool, man. When it's in shape, you should send it to us. And the rest is, as they say, in movie history.
So let's delve into the actual script. We begin on a bright Miami day, or what we can see of it at least, our gaze fixed looking out through the front windshield of a vintage car. Beyond the car is Juan, 30s Afro-Latino. He retrieves a handwritten CDR and pushes it into the custom console. A chopped and screwed version of Curtis Mayfield's Little Child Running Wild plays on the sound system. I suppose I should ask here, so when you're writing screenplays, is the directorial side of your brain kind of whirring at the same time? As you compose scenes on the page, are you already thinking, oh, okay, here's how I'm going to shoot this? Or do you try and decompartmentalize the two processes?
I don't think of here's how I'm going to shoot this, but I try to write in a way, and this is when it gets tricky when I'm writing things for other people, but I try to write the script as though, in the way that the audience is going to see the film. What's good about that is it automatically clicks me in that I need to write from a point of view, you know? And as far as the screenplay goes, not even from an emotional point of view, but from literally a sound and image point of view. And that doesn't necessarily yield itself as, editing or camera positions, but it does mean that I am sort of like this phantom that's standing on that block, and I'm looking at things this way and that way. The really cool thing is my cinematographer, James Laxton, we've been working together since film school. I've been writing the same way since film school. So if I hand him the script, then he can see it as well. And as we build this village of collaborators, with the way that I approach the scene work, the writing of the scenes, they can see it as well. Because when you get on the set, it's all about communication. And the more I can communicate on the page, the less communication I have to do on the day on set. Right, so yeah. It's tough, man. I try to mitigate how much of that I'm doing on the page, but I can't deny that I want the reading of the script to be as evocative as the watching of the film.
So my second question about this opening sequence is about music. So page one, there we have it, our first mention of music, that Curtis Mayfield, chopped and screwed version. Music has such a vital role in the identity and the character of each act. I'm wondering, when you were writing Moonlight, did you listen to the music corresponding to each moment in the story? Are you a writer that uses music to kind of submerge yourself in the mood of a scene?
Submerge myself, sure. And usually I'm listening to the same song over and over and over again as I'm writing the script. And so I can think back to exactly what I was writing, or what I was listening to at the time that I was writing these screenplays, but it's not tailored to the script so much. And so Little Child Running Wild is not in Moonlight, obviously. Yeah. I think we found a much more appropriate song, although in the first cut, because again, the script is it's the one thing everyone can look towards as a unifying piece. So the editor got that. And, when he made the first assembly of that chapter, Little Child Running Wild was playing. We actually shot that scene, not in the film. There's this whole montage of Juan driving around Miami that nobody will ever see, but we shot it. But no, usually the writing process and what's being written to me are very separate. And so I listened to this Frank Ocean album called Channel Orange, but chopped and screwed to be called Channel Purple.
Yeah.
Yeah, I listened to that while writing the script, and it's nowhere. It's not. I don't think it's referenced in the script, and it's certainly not in the film. But it was the mood I needed to be in to write.
You mentioned Juan there. What does that character represent to you? You begin the story with him, and you loop back around to a character like him at the beginning of Act 3, when we meet grown-up Chiron, or Black, as he's then known. There's some kind of circularity there that seems to be saying something about like the male archetype that young Black men are conditioned into becoming by their surroundings. Is that fair to say? What does Juan represent in Chiron's life?
Totally, absolutely, and I think and that's more a thing of Tarell than it is of Barry. I love that when we went off to make the film, Mahershala really made it his own, and Trevante really made the character of Black his own. But the character of Juan is based on a real person in Tarell's life. And for me, it was based on the coaches I had in athletics growing up in the neighborhood you see depicted in the film. Those men were the father figures that I looked up to growing up the way Little did. And for Tarell, there was an actual Juan. The character's name was Blue, but I thought having a blue and a little and a black might be too much. So in Tarell's play, Juan's name is Blue, which interesting because Juan in the movie ends up calling Chiron Blue.
Yeah.
Or actually, he tells the story of the woman in Cuba calling him Blue.
Right.
So we do hold on to it a bit. But yeah, that character is taken directly from Tarell. And I think the working out of the third chapter, which isn't as prominent in Tarell's play as it is in the film, was about what could have happened to Little, to Chiron, to Tarell McCraney, had he not had this figure in his life of Juan.
Juan's fate kind of goes unmentioned, unexplained. So he's there in Act 1, this adoptive father figure. Then we meet teenage Little, or Chiron as he's then known, in Act 2. There's this tender scene between him and Janelle Monáe's character where they're making a bed together, but Juan is noticeable by his absence. The audience is left to infer that he passed away, or at least that was my reading of it. Was there any stage in the development of Moonlight when you kind of contemplated dealing more explicitly with what happened to Juan?
Never. Even from the very first draft, part of the process of being emboldened enough to write the script, and when I decided I was going to make it, I had a friend, someone I trust, who said to me, "Are you sure you want to make this as your second film? This very artsy movie about a Black gay kid from projects with a drug addicted mom who becomes a drug dealer himself. Are you sure that's what you want to do?" And I was sure it was what I wanted to do. And so it gave me the confidence to do things exactly as I wanted to do them. But it was cool because with that confidence, I understood that there's a shorthand in this film for the audience that grew up where these characters grew up. And so if you're from a neighborhood like the one depicted in this film, you know exactly what happened to Juan. You know exactly what happened to Mahershala Ali. You know exactly why he's not there in the second chapter. Everyone else maybe has to catch up. And I thought, you know what, that's fine. Because sometimes, I grew up watching, Family Ties or Leave It to Beaver or The Brady Bunch, or Full House. And I had to catch up because I wasn't from that world. And so, yeah, it was intentional. And there was never even a hint of explaining more explicitly what happens to that character.
We soon meet the central character whose story we're going to follow for the entire film. So you've got it here on the script as 3 young boys with sticks chase Little, a runt, who is running, terrified. The 3 boys laugh as they give chase, but this is not a game, more like a hunt. He runs into this dilapidated housing estate in a panic. The rest of the film from there is his story told through his eyes. Because this character is drawn partly from your own life, did he just spill out onto the page for you, or were there still challenges in bringing him to life?
I wrote the first draft of the script in about 10 days. So yeah, it just spilled out. It just spilled out. Now, mind you, a lot of that work had been done by Tarell. The opening of the film is pretty faithful to the opening of the script, I should say, is pretty faithful to the opening of Tarell's play. But even more so, Tarell was that kid, and kind of I was that kid. And so even though I didn't set out to make a film that was autobiographical, there was just so much I could pull from. And so, yeah, it spilled right out. I have never had as fluid a writing experience on anything as with this script, which is terrible to say, man, because I would love to be able to look forward to, extremely fluid writing experiences. But I know that one that every writer gets, it might be behind me,
Do you just put that down to how personal and intimate the story was and your familiarity with that character? Because it's you in a way.
I think so. And I think also, too, I was hungry, man. I was so hungry. I mean, I was in the middle of nowhere, Brussels, Belgium, in July. I didn't know a single person. I had a flat and I had a block. I would walk to this one cafe, this one restaurant, this one bar, and there was a menswear store on the street, and I befriended this one clerk at the menswear store. That was my life for those 10 days. And so, in a way, my only friends were these characters. My life was the script. I was fully within it. And yeah, I wouldn't say it just spilled out. It was work. I mean, it was definitely work. But this was the kind of writing experience where I didn't know exactly where each of the chapters would end. But every time I would get to the end of a chapter, I would just be there with my little whiskey at this bar called Lord Byron. And just realize, oh shit, that one's done. Like that was done. And then I just move on to the next. And then I looked up, and I wasn't planning to write it as quickly as I did, but I looked up and I was like, oh damn, I'm done. And I ordered another drink, and then I went back to the flat, and I thought, I think I should go somewhere else. And so I just went to Berlin.
I wish my trips to Brussels and Berlin were as productive as yours, Barry.
Bro, hey, as I've tried it again and it didn't work as well. So yeah, I wish also.
So Juan becomes this adoptive father figure in Little's life, leading to this extraordinarily moving dinner scene in which Little asks him, "What's a faggot?" Can you tell me about the evolution of that scene and the kind of tenderness that you packed it with?
Yeah, that was a tough one because I don't believe that scene is in the play, and I think that was for me a working out of, what needs to be what does Juan need to give to Little that's going to carry him on for the next 60 minutes, for the next 2 chapters of his life as told through the story. And it felt like this question, this idea between them, the shame that Little is only beginning to realize and actualize because the world around him is forcing him to, is projecting it onto him, that Juan needed to be this vessel that helps him unpack it. And, I try not to read reviews of my work. And, when you release a film, especially the way this film was released, the studio, the publicist, they aggregate all the reviews and they send you clips. And I told them, don't send me anything. But then Hilton Als reviewed the film for the New Yorker.
Yeah.
And Paula Woods, my publicist, she said, you have to read this one. And I love, in writing about the scene, Hilton says, Little asks Juan, what's a faggot? And Juan unpacks the word, but he doesn't unpack the boy with it. And I remember feeling like that was what my job was. And because there was a line that I felt like that I wasn't sure I could cross, which is a lot of this is autobiographical for me. And yet, Little's sexual identity is not mine. Tarell's sexual identity is not mine. And so who am I as the author of this piece to wrestle with this question, this facet of his identity? But I also felt like if we're all human beings and we all are dealing and wrestling with the same issues, the same preoccupations, regardless of our sexual identities, that I should be able to, as Hilton said, help this character unpack this. And so I wrote it, man. And I wrote all the stories in sequence. So I want to say it was the last thing that I wrote in that chapter very early in the days in Brussels. And I remember getting to the end of it and just being like, oh shit, I don't know how we're going to film this, but I know that we have to film it. And then I moved on because I could just skate into the next chapter, teenage years, which is much more comfortable.
But before we get there, we have Act 1 kind of culminate in this almost baptismal kind of scene as Juan takes Little swimming in the ocean. And Moonlight is actually kind of punctuated by these moments involving water and the beach. So later we'll see Chiron have this transformative sexual experience by the beach. The film ends by a shoreline as well. Can you tell me about that motif of water and the shore and how it kind of fits into the story that you were telling?
That's the beauty of Tarell Alvin McCraney. Even the naming of the character Chiron, it's just a masterful stroke by Tarell. And the theme of water is present all throughout the play as well, which the play culminates early in the third chapter of the film. Chiron, or Black, I should say, and Kevin don't reunite in the play. Again, that was where I felt like I have to step forward and maybe, very terrifiedly, I don't know if that's a word, but take Tarell's beautiful piece and extend it a bit. But the water was there; it was baked in. And what I love about that is, I think there are certain stories that can exist in many different mediums, and this was a really beautiful play. As evidenced by the fact that Andrew hounded me, and once I read it, I realized, oh, I think this has to be my second film. And yet there's something about taking this thing from one medium to the next, and the play and the script are both text, but I know it's going to end up in sound and images, and just the notion of water. And as you said, this baptism, it just felt like, okay, there's going to be the spiritual transference between Juan and Little. And I'll say the one thing I'll give myself credit for is there were two scenes. One, there was a swimming lesson, and one also taught Little how to ride a bike. And I thought, oh, this bike shit. No, we're not doing that. We're doing the swimming scene.
We then slip into Act 2. Little is now Chiron. We're thrust into this classroom scene where we see the brutality almost of school as this prototype battleground for performances of masculinity. Chiron's being terrorized by this bully, but he has this friend. The entire act is just heartbreaking. The setup of this friendship, the blossoming of that friendship into a sexual moment between the two. Then this painful act of betrayal that wounds both parties so deeply. Can you tell me about the construction of this act? I mean, was all of this in Tarell's play?
No, I think of the three acts, the one that's most faithful to the play is Act 2. I think Tarell lived those things. That scene between Naomi Harris and Ashton Sanders in the courtyard, where she says, give me the money. That actually happened to Tarell. That I added a few flourishes, and of course, visually we filmed it, but that was Tarell. I think of the three chapters, the one that's taken most directly from Tarell's life is chapter 2, and that lovely scene on the beach. What's that line? Sometimes I cry so much I think I'm gonna turn and it drops. That's Tarell Alvin McCraney. I mean, that's why I'm so glad we both got statues, because he earned the hell out of that statue. Yeah. Chapter 2 is very faithful to Tarell. What I love is that as a director, and this was the first of 3 adaptations for me. Jesus Christ. But when you're working in adaptations, is sometimes the trick is, what do I not fuck up? And in chapter 2, there were a lot of things where I was like, don't fuck that up. And then, I was going to say Tarell, Freudian slip, Chiron coming home and just washing his face in that water. Yeah. That was one of those things that James and I were like, oh, this is going to be really intense. And adding the flickering light and all those things. And then the whole walk to the school. It's interesting. I know this is a screenplay podcast, but with this script in particular, I knew no one else, absolutely no one else was going to direct this. And so for me, with chapter 2, more than chapter 1 for sure, chapter 3 is a whole different beast. My job was, okay, how do I visually translate what Tarell is doing? The big thing for me was point of view. Chapter 1, I think, is much more observant of Little. Chapter 2, you're kind of with Chiron. It's almost like the camera's glued to him in a certain way. It's almost like watching a third-person shooter kind of video game where the camera's just a little bit behind you, like Grand Theft Auto or something like that.
Yeah, as he walks through the school to get his revenge and that sort of
exactly. Chapter 2 felt like, we just want the audience, because here's the thing. Chapter 1 is about a child, and it's really easy to identify or to have empathy, and to a certain degree sympathy for a child. Chapter 2, we wanted the audience to understand how and why this character becomes who he becomes in chapter 3. And so to do that, we felt like there had to be an extreme proximity to him in the second chapter of the film. And so for me, it was about making the story beats as clean as possible, and making the visual storytelling as immersive as possible as well. And it's why there isn't really a direct to camera moment that's as visually intense in chapter 1 as there is in chapter 2, in the scene where Naomi Harris is demanding that Chiron give her the money. In that case, we completely place the audience in between the two characters. And even from the script moment, we kind of knew that was going to happen. I think there's a line in the script where it says, Paula flashes a smile that's been forgiven many times over and will be many times more. So, something like that. I haven't read it in a while. But yeah, it was like, okay, we're going to put you in now. We're going to put you in.
Were those scenes involving Naomi Harris's character, the mother, were they the hardest to write because of their proximity to your own life, Barry?
They weren't the hardest to write for me because, again, so much of chapter 2 is taken directly from Tarell's life. They were the hardest to film.
Mm-hmm.
They were the hardest to film. Every scene with Naomi in this film was the hardest to film. They were the hardest to film. The scene in the 3rd chapter with the rehab scene between Paula and Black, there's a version of that scene that's in the play, and we sort of took it and just put a bit more air into it. But yeah, every scene with Naomi Harris was the hardest scene to film. And also we had to do them all in 3 days. And so there was no place to hide. We did all of her work on 3 consecutive days. And so it was the only time in the whole process, whether writing or filming, where you didn't have the luxury of, I'm just with Little now. I'm just with Chiron now. I'm just with Black. When Naomi showed up, it was Little, Black, Chiron, Little, Chiron, Black. We were just jumping back and forth. And, there's something psychotic about that, because you're seeing your mother, and when she's in the Little chapter, she's your mother. This is who you remember. And then when you're in the Chiron chapter, it's like, this is also your mother, and you also remember. And then when you get to that 3rd chapter, this is your mother, and you wish you had that moment. So yeah, it was intense.
Can you tell me a bit about this scene that we then get to, in which Chiron and Kevin share that sexual embrace on the beach? So there's so much beauty in there. There's so much tenderness in this scene. How many attempts did it take to nail what it was you wanted to do with this scene when you were writing Moonlight?
Script-wise, again, quite a bit of that is from Tarell's play. I would say of all the scenes in the script and the play, that one he used the closest to the source material, to the text. Part of that for me was I don't have that experience. I just didn't. I didn't live that moment. And so it felt like, to me, the wisest thing to do was to let Tarell guide me through it. And then here and there, and again, as I'm talking to you, I'm talking mostly about the first draft of the script. I'm talking about sitting down and writing it for the first time, because that scene was one that evolved by degrees over the course of rewrites. And every iteration of it, I did allow myself to assert my authorial voice over the text. But of all the scenes in the script, that one is the most faithful to the play. Filming it, that's a whole different conversation. That's a whole, because getting that right, again, you mentioned this word tenderness, getting that right on the day, getting a scene that on the surface should be incredibly awkward, and yet rendering it so that for the audience, the feeling of it is incredibly tender. That's a very delicate balancing act.
Because I guess it's not just tenderness. There's also fear and the sense of like a line being crossed that there's no kind of way of uncrossing, I guess.
Exactly. And you were talking about themes at the very beginning of our talk. And I will say, if there's a place in the script, in the film, in the play, where those themes are just written in 3,000 point font, it's this sequence, all this fear, this awkwardness, this tenderness, hesitation, because this is not what men or what boys do. Air quotes now, it's a podcast. This is not what boys do. This is not how they touch one another. It's not how they look at one another. And so why do they feel this extreme desire to look at one another, to touch one another? And how can we get to a place where that look, that touch is not only accepted, but wanted, relished, where it's, as you say, tender. Doing that in one night with 8 hours of darkness where you got to set up lights, where now, instead of it just being two boys who finally have just the space, this piece of sand that's all their own, there's 40 crew standing around who were also, witnessing, the performance of this awkwardness, this tenderness. I mean, it was, other than the scene between Juan and Little at the dinner table, what's a faggot? This was the most tricky scene for me to film. Writing it though, I have so much love and respect for what Tarell does that writing it was a dream. It was a dream. I'll say translating it was a dream.
Mm. So then there's that moment of betrayal where, sort of Kevin is kind of forced to beat up Chiron, and it sort of sends Chiron on sort of a bit of a dark path, and the act ends with this like moment of violence, and we go into Act 3, where Chiron is now black. I've heard you describe this version of the character as masculinity run amok. I was wondering if you can tell me what you meant by that, and how you went about writing in this exaggerated performance of manhood into the script through things like his car and his demeanor.
Yeah, I mean, so again, all praise to Tarell Alvin McCraney. The third story of the film and of the script is the one that is the least represented in the play. However, the character himself is constructed in the play, and here's the thing: it wasn't necessary to have that character fully fleshed out in the play, because I know boys where Tarell and I grew up who go through this metamorphosis, air quotes now, because a metamorphosis is something that is natural, that is driven, caterpillars turn into butterflies. In this case, a boy like Chiron is bullied and beaten and pressured, so much to the point that instead of allowing himself to become whatever kind of butterfly he's meant to be, he decides to shape himself, or reshape himself into, as I said in some press interview many years ago, masculinity run amok. And to me, the whole point of constructing the character that way, and again, this is when you talk about the difference between a printed medium and a visual medium, is I wanted the audience to look at this character and see, oh wow, that's the guy I'm going to cross the street. If I see him walking down the sidewalk, that's the guy. If he pulls up next to me at the stoplight, I'm going to roll my windows up. And yet to still look, and if you look long enough, you see Alex Hibbert. You see that same little boy from the first chapter of Moonlight, who you would never even think to cross the street from. And to me, that was what the job was. That was what, to me, you talk about themes, that was the whole point, of making this film.
And why was it important to you to make the changes that you did by having him reunite with Kevin and having Kevin ask him that question, who is you, Chiron?
It was just out of love for the character, man. What I really enjoy about the process of making films, of telling stories, is when I'm reminded of what it's like just to be somebody in the audience or sitting down with a book, going through and experiencing for the first time, that just mesmerizing feeling, that exhilarating feeling of like, oh my God, I'm just like so moved by what's happening in front of me. And because this originated with Tarell, I just fell so in love with the idea of Little becoming Chiron, becoming black. And I just felt like these guys, I remember saying it out loud to Andrew Havia, and to Tarell before I went off to write the adaptation. I just want you to know, I need these two characters to sit down. I just need them to sit down, and I need Kevin to look at Chiron and see what he's done. I just need it. And in being seen, I need to know how that is going to open black, if it's going to open black. And I'll tell you, sitting in, being in Brussels, I'm going back to the first draft of the script, there was a roadmap for the first 2/3 of the film. Little, that was there. Chiron, that was there. The outline, the structure was there. There were all these different scenes I could pull from, add to, accentuate. third chapter, I wasn't there. It was just the phone call. Black picks up the phone, he calls, Kevin answers. And I was like, holy shit, I'm so in love with these characters. Once he hears that voice, he's going to go to it. And when he goes to it, it's going to be fucking electric. It just is. And that's me now, not as a writer. That's not ego. That's me as an audience member, because these are Tarell's characters. Yeah. And I go, fuck, what is that electric feeling? Well, here we go. I just sat down and with a lot of whiskey, I just got at it. And I remember the question of who is you, Chiron, but also just that moment, talk about now visual language, that first moment when they see each other. I haven't read the script in a while, so I'm not sure if that's in there. The moment I do remember, and this is the script excerpt that's kicked to me the most, and I apologize to all the screenplay professors in colleges and universities all over the world. But man, the only time that I look at my own writing and I feel a sense of accomplishment is if there's a scene that's filmed, and the filmed version is successful and evocative, and I can go back to the script retroactively. So after the scene is done, I can go back to the script and see on the page the same thing. That's when I feel like, damn, I did good work. And this excerpt always comes back to me every now and then on Twitter, where it's Black is driving Kevin home, and Kevin says, "Where are you gonna stay tonight?" And they look at each other. I forget what the actual writing is, but it ends up with saying the earth just moved. They both felt it. And I was like, and I don't remember how that came into my head, but I do know it was about just that electric feeling, and we filmed the scene. And I think what's really cool about the way this screenplay is written, and some of the other things I've written, I try to do the same thing, is the actors read that and they know. They have an understanding of what the tone, of what the feeling is. And so, I look at Andre and I look at Travante in that scene now, whenever that clip comes back to me, and I go, oh shit, yeah, the earth did just move, And I say I want to apologize to screenplay professors, because that's an example where, yeah, it's something that can't be filmed or heard, which is what they tell you, and yet it can certainly be felt. It can absolutely be felt. And when I watch that scene, I know that those guys feel it and the audience feels it. So fuck it, I'm going to overwrite that scene. I'm sorry, I went off on a tangent, man, but far in the past now, and writing it is even farther in the past. But and man, it's the quarantine. I don't know who's going to listen to this, but this is a stressful ass time right now, man. It really is. People who have Oscars, they get stressed too. So this is a stressful, intense ass time. And it's really easy to disassociate or become so far removed from the things you've accomplished. But I think more than that, from the work you've done is a better way of saying it. And so thank you, man, because I haven't thought about that in quite a bit. But the creation of that scene in particular, but the script as a whole, was so pure, man. And yeah, it's lovely to end up at a place where I can look back at the stuff and go, yeah, this shit works, man. It absolutely worked. But apologies to all the screenplay professors and all the college classes all over the world, because I know the demographic for that book that A24 printed, and it's definitely kids in screenwriting classes who want to tell their professors, see, no, I can write shit that can't be seen or heard. Oh, man.
So, Barry, that ending, what does it mean to you? I mean, there's closure in the ending, but there's ambiguity also. I was wondering if you could describe what that ending offers in bringing the character's arc to a point of completion in one sense, without fully kind of wrapping things up in a neat little bow.
Yeah, to me, especially looking at the performance that Travante gives in the last chapter of the film, look, in both the script and the film, I knew I wanted to end with little. I wanted to remind the audience that no matter what happens to that character, at his heart, he still is the same little boy. And no matter what you saw in the second or the third chapter, he's still that little boy. And the audience's understanding for him, their relation to him, is very clear in the first chapter of the film. Very clear. And I don't know, it just felt like, and Alex Hibbert gave such a wonderful performance that it felt just that I wanted, there's a, there's this sense of interrogation with this film. I'll be honest. There's this idea of actors or characters looking directly at the audience. It was something James and I had experimented with on earlier short films, but never to the degree that we do in this film. And now I'm speaking more of the production of the film, because it's not something that is keyed in the screenplay. I mean, literally Naomi Harris and Alex Hibbert looking at each other down the hall, that's kind of referenced in the script, but the way we filmed it just happened on the day. And so I knew that this idea of being a passive observer or creating a film that is a very voyeuristic experience, that was something I was interested in. And so to me, it was almost a confrontation with the audience, that they had to, at the very end of seeing all this, look this little boy in the eye, because how many boys and how many men, do we look in the eyes all the time that we don't allow ourselves to actually see? And so to me, after going through this journey of walking a mile in this character's shoes, it was very important that the audience have to look him in the eye, as the closing image of the film. Now, I tell you, both in the script and in production, Little actually turns away from the camera and he walks out into the ocean. In the script, he actually swims out into the ocean. But I learned very quickly that when you're filming a scene at Magic Hour in Miami, that's when sharks come to feed. And they actually like very small beings. And so the lifeguards would not allow us to have Alex Hibbert walk very far into the water. But if you go back to the footage, he turns back, he looks at the audience, then he turns and he walks into the water and the camera fades to black. But as we were in post-production, this is what I love about making films. Sometimes the director knows better than the writer. Sometimes a friend of the director knows better than the director, because a good friend of mine, Mark Sariak, who now works in my company, Pastel, who went to film school with, he gave one note when he watched the film, and his one note was, I don't think he should look away. I was like, huh? He goes, yeah, I think you just cut to black and not have him look away. And so I was like, man, you crazy. But, hey, I'm never afraid to be wrong. And so any note somebody gives me, I always try. And so we did it one time, and I turned to him and I said, fuck, because I don't want to be wrong, but he was definitely right. And so, yeah, that's how the last image became the last image.
And when you tell a story about a character as intimately as you did in Moonlight, how long does that character stay with you afterwards? Do you ever find yourself kind of imagining what happened to that character after the credits rolled, where the rest of his life may have led?
Man, the making of this film, I'm not going to answer your question as intellectually beautifully as you asked it. I'm just going to say it sucks, man, because, I don't know how many more things I'm going to go on to make, but the more I make, the farther away I'll get from this film. But I can't imagine anything else being as intense as my relationship to this character, man. I mean, it was intense, man. I mean, I was dead in the water as a writer, as a director, as a filmmaker, and writing this thing. It's interesting because now fucking social media, sometimes this film was referred to as Oscar bait. And then like, do you have any idea how this film was made? The idea of Oscars or catching anything, I'm unpacking the word bait. It's just like, it just doesn't exist with this film. But everything was so intimate, as you say, and so intense that this character will be with me forever. Lulu and I are here in LA, and on one of our very few drives, we're driving down the street, and there's a billboard for the show on Showtime made by Lena Waithe called The Chi. Yeah. And Alex Hibbert, the Little in Moonlight, he's one of the stars of The Chi. He's the center of this billboard. And this is a kid who had never acted in a film before. And Adela and I walked into a youth center, and he came over, he auditioned, and now he's on a billboard in LA. It's like, I mean, it goes beyond awards. It goes beyond craft. That's just like, that's life, man. Mm-hmm. And I think this film, for me, it gave me back my life. And this character of Chiron, that Tarell trusted me with, gave me back my life. And that's what's so meaningful about these interactions I have either on social media or at festivals with other people, is it also gave them a piece of themselves when they're able to walk into a theater or sit at home and identify with this character. To have that happen from somebody just sitting down at a laptop typing in words, because that's where it began, it's astounding, man. It moves me so much more than any trophy or box office, because there was a moment where I thought I'd never get to that place, where I'd never make another film again, and I would never make anything that would mean so much to me, myself, and also to an audience. So pretty damn cool, man. Like I said, I wasn't going to be as intellectually beautiful as your question, but I'll give you an answer, bro.
On top of all the other ways that Moonlight broke new ground, it was also the first LGBTQ narrative movie to win Best Picture at the Oscars. What impact do you hope that you might have created hitting that milestone? So when there's like a big mainstream blockbuster like Gina Price Bythewood's fantastic The Old Guard, that's able to kind of feature these beautifully written gay characters whose sexuality is so naturalistically and tenderly kind of displayed on screen, are you kind of proud to contemplate the possibility that Moonlight's success perhaps contributed to that being just a kind of more normal thing to see in a big studio movie in 2020?
I mean, yeah, in a certain way, but that's easier for me to do, because I think success of Moonlight has less to do with me than it does with the audience or with the industry, with the people who actually went to see the film. And I have to frame it that way because I have friends and peers who've made things that I think are every bit as worthy as the film we made, but didn't get nearly the same attention. And so I don't think I have to demystify the specialness of the film itself and acknowledge the specialness of the moment, because I don't think Moonlight is the first film of its kind that deserved the kind of distinction that it received. But, you know, I have to also be real and be honest with myself. Yeah, I've never seen anything like what happened with this movie, and it's shocking to me that I got to be a part of it. And yeah, as I see other things come in the wake of this film, and other people who deserve every bit of their success, have that success acknowledged, because this film in some small way created a more direct path to access that success. Yeah, it feels incredibly rewarding. The good thing is that feeling is in retrospect, because had I had any inkling that was going to be the case, the pressure would have been far too great. It was such a very small film. Now, I was watching Survivor last night. I wish I hadn't said that, because I don't want anybody who's waiting on work for me to know that I was watching an episode of Survivor. But I was watching an old episode of Survivor, and this character got voted off first in season 15. And I actually wrote down what he said, because after you get voted off, you go back and you give a quote. And he said, "There is no one more proud to play such a small part in a big adventure." And that's how I feel about the life of Moonlight. There's no one more proud to have played such a small part in such a big adventure. And I think Moonlight, to be honest, hopefully is going to be just a very small part of what's going to be just this big awakening of both our industry and our art form to many more diverse voices and characters and languages.
That's beautifully put. And we began this conversation talking about Underground Railroad. That's what you've been working on during this trying period. That deals with subject matter that's, always timely, but especially so now. Can you tell me about the spirit of that show and how you think the series will intersect with this incredible time? Yeah,
it's interesting, because we began production in August of last year, and we finished, air quotes, production in March of this year. So when we began this process, especially, the writing of the script and everything, but even the physical production, none of these things were, maybe we should have anticipated them, but they didn't seem like they were on the horizon. And now that we're editing the show, when everything first began, it kind of like dovetailed with, us just going into the edit room. And one of the producers said, "Man, it's so wild that all this stuff is happening right now." Because it would have been very interesting to reference some of these things in the show. And then as we've ended up getting more and more episodes cut together, we realized, oh, wow, it must have been in the air, because it's all being referenced in the show. I think in a way that just goes to illustrate how little things have changed. in American society.
Yeah.
And I'll say this: this is the heaviest thing I've ever worked on. I mean, in the making of Moonlight, the making of Beale Street, I didn't shed a single tear in production. We had a therapist on set for the run of the show, and I cried many times on this set. And there was even a day where the therapist, Miss Kim, pulled me aside and would not let me direct my own show until I had a session with her. And so I had to stop one day, and the whole production stopped for about 45 minutes, and I had to have a session with this therapist because the things I was carrying, it was just too much. And so I don't know how that projects for what the show is ultimately going to end up being. I think it's really beautiful and powerful. I'm incredibly proud of it. I think it's going to have a very large part to do with what I do next. But, when all these things began, I turned to Joy McMillan, who was the editor on Moonlight and Beale Street, and James, and I just told them how proud I was to be working with them because, anytime these things happen, and they happen so often in America right now, people who look to our work and they see those things reflected, which means we're not reacting, we're just very much in tune with the world that we live in, and we're reflecting that in the things we create. So, yeah, I mean, it's heavy. I think it's very beautiful and also very heavy.
Well, we can't wait to see it, Barry. This has been so interesting. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for this beautiful film. And thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you, guys. And I apologize to any listeners who think that I'm making them sleepy, but man, this puppy is making me sleepy. So shout out to all the puppy owners of the world, man. I'm with y'all in solidarity.
You've been listening to Script Apart, hosted by me, Al Horner, produced by Kamil Demek, with music from Stefan Bindley-Taylor. Get in touch. You can find us on Twitter, Instagram, or you can email us, thescriptapartpodcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.